Welcome to this Enabling Change Specific Interest Group webinar, which is focused on the journey of change undertaken by Staffordshire Fire and Rescue Service. I'm Martin Taylor, Chair of the Enabling Change SIG, and I'm joined by Becci Bryant, Chief Executive of Staffordshire Fire and Rescue Service, who will be giving the main presentation. So I'll do a brief introduction into our SIG and give an overview. Then we've got the main presentation by Becci on a journey of change. Then we'll do the questions and a couple of slides to finish on the SIG resources, and then we'll be closing the webinar. The mission, so our mission in this Enabling Change SIG is to improve the change capability of organisations, teams and individuals, and we do measurement of this after each event. Our SIG is structured through a number of themes. So we've got a theme for events, membership and communications, one for change methods and standards, and one for change innovation, which includes collaboration and research. Then we've got a number of practitioner groups around specific industries. So we've got one in transport, one in public services, one for utilities, and we're just starting up a new one for the manufacturing sector. So we've now got up over 600 members in our change community, and this is how we develop and share knowledge and improve our change capability through the SIG. So I'd just like to introduce Becci Bryant before we go on to her presentation. Becci joined Staffordshire Fire and Rescue Service in 2005 after serving with Cheshire Fire Service and Bedfordshire and Luton Fire and Rescue Service. Becci was previously in the role of Deputy Chief Executive. During recent years, Becci has led the service through various transformative changes, including restructure of the management teams, a new crewing model for whole-time stations, and changes to the emergency response model. Becci's current responsibilities include providing the strategic leadership for the continued transformation of the service, along with providing professional support to the Fire and Rescue Authority. So I'd now like to hand over to Becci to undertake the main presentation.
Martin, thank you very much, and thank you to APM for the opportunity to share some of the journey of change that Staffordshire Fire and Rescue Service has been on over the last coming up to 8 years. I thought it was really important to give you all some context into the Fire and Rescue Service, because I'll be aware that a number of people may have had some dealings with their local Fire and Rescue Service, and some may not have had anything to do with their Fire and Rescue Service at all. So Staffordshire Fire and Rescue Service is what is known as a combined fire service operating under a fire and rescue authority. That basically means that we are a standalone organisation in our own right. Not all fire and rescue services have the same type of governance arrangement as ours. Some work as part of a county council, others work as part of a metropolitan. We most recently have a PCC governance model and a mayoral model in Manchester. But for us as Staffordshire Fire and Rescue Service, it means that we are a standalone organisation, which means that we provide our services across the whole of the county of Staffordshire. As a county, we have in the region of 1.1 million residents who reside in around about 483,000 households. We have a very large geographical area, and for those of you who may not be aware, Staffordshire is in really the heart of the Midlands, north of Birmingham and just south of Manchester. Across the county, we have 35 fire and rescue sites, and those comprise of a number of community fire stations, our headquarters site, and a joint emergency services transportation hub. So in respect of the budget and the staff over the last few years, you can see there just some figures taken from really the start of austerity that the Fire and Rescue Service experienced through to hopefully our proposed budget, which goes before our fire authority as of next week. So in terms of those staff numbers that you can see there, those staff numbers incorporate whole-time firefighting staff. Those are staff that most people would normally associate with the Fire and Rescue Service. So they provide cover on a 24-hour basis at a number of our fire stations. We also have retained duty staff, So these are individuals who will have another employer, but who will respond on an alerter. And then we also have professional services, and they would include what individuals would traditionally refer to as support services, so things like HR, finance, information technology, etc. For us in Staffordshire Fire and Rescue Service, it's really important that they're recognised for their profession, so we refer to them as professional services. In terms of the budget that you can see there, we receive the budget in a number of different ways, but to try and make it really simple, we are a precepting authority, which means that we set our own council tax limits, and we therefore receive around about today 63% of our funding from the council tax that is raised locally. We then get 37% of our budget from central government, and that's split into a number of different areas. We have an amount that comes from the business rates that are raised locally. We also have a top-up for those business rates. And then we get something called the RSG, which is our revenue support grant. And what I'm sure you'll notice on the slide that's in front of you is that grant has been cut quite considerably from 2011-2012 through to that grant for 2018-2019. During the period of austerity that you see in front of you, we also had our council tax frozen. So that was frozen for a 4-year period from 2010-11 through to 2014-15. So that basically meant that at the same time as the revenue support grant being cut, we weren't able to increase any income generated through council tax over and above that locally. So there's been quite a considerable reduction in the budget for the service over the last 10 years. Back in 2008, the then Chief, Peter Dartford, he had a look at the organisation and recognised that in a number of pockets of the service, there was some really excellent work going on where groups of staff were empowered, they were able to make decisions for themselves, and they really got on to making the biggest difference they possibly could to their communities. And Peter wanted to understand how we could spread that across the whole organisation. And so it was a really important start to our cultural journey and creating a culture in which people flourish at work. The leadership message that you see in front of you is a really easy to understand, single page focus on what it's like to work at Staffordshire Fire and Rescue Service. But this wasn't developed in what some might consider a very traditional manner, where the top perhaps 20% of leaders within organisations sit down in a darkened room and come up with it. Actually, this is something that was owned by the staff, created by the staff for the staff. And it was around about 2008 when we started our workshops looking at what our purpose as an organisation was. And I think it's really important to note that that was the time at which the service was trying to move away from a very command and control culture to one where decision making was at the level that it should be at, so people could make the right decisions at the right time to ensure the best outcomes for the residents. We continue to use the leadership message today. It's part of everything that we do, and we have champions who have carried on the work since those very initial launch events back in 2008. As we then moved into the period of austerity around about 2010, because our fire and rescue service had already undertaken a number of changes, we had our first round of cuts really backloaded to 2012-2013. But what was very important was some real definitions around, if we're going to make any changes to the organisation, then what are our red lines? So the Chief and the Fire Authority developed a number of red lines that I'll just quickly go through with you. The first one being that any changes that were made to the way the organisation was structured or delivered could not compromise firefighter safety. So when firefighters are going out to do the most dangerous part of their role, which is dealing with emergency incidents, nothing we would have done could compromise their safety on the incident ground. Importantly, we also looked to ensure there were no compromises to community safety, and that's community safety in its broadest sense. This isn't just about responding to emergencies, this is also about trying to stop those emergencies happening in the first instance. And then finally, we have our dotted red line, which was about protecting as many livelihoods as possible. Now, just to be quite clear on that point, that protect as many livelihoods as possible was not about keeping the same number of staff in employment that we had back in 2010, 2011. And you'll have seen from those very first figures that there has been a considerable reduction in the number of staff that work for us. But what we aim to do as an organisation was use all the natural opportunities that come up with people who are conditioned to effectively a 30-year career through their pension, but then to use other opportunities such as redeployments into other areas of the organisation, enhanced voluntary redundancy packages for professional services staff should there be an opportunity for them to potentially leave the organisation, and then importantly, development for individuals who were going to look elsewhere around really simple things like writing CVs and preparing for interviews. So back in 2010, we deliberately chose a systems thinking approach for public services. And that gave us a methodology by which all of our transformation over the last 7 years, and indeed continuing transformation, is undertaken. And within the systems thinking approach, there are 3 key relationships. The first key relationship is looking at how our thinking creates the systems that we put in place, and then what that does in terms of performance. So Henry Ford famously said, if we always do what we've always done, we'll always get what we've always got. And this was a real challenge to the thinking in a fire and rescue service that was based in hierarchy and that had taken the way of managing from the incident ground into the business world. And of course, that's not always the best way to do things. So it was really important that we understood this first key relationship. The second key relationship looks at purpose, measures, and method. Interestingly, when we looked at this relationship, of course, we assumed that the purpose would be responding to incidents. But importantly, what we learned through developing our internal team of consultants was that this purpose is from the customer's perspective. So these are the people that we deal with in our community on a daily basis. Our residents, our young people, our stakeholders and partners. So it was important that we understood from their point of view what the fire service was there to do. Now, of course, one of the key purposes we did expect they would share with us was, we want you to deal with emergencies when they happen. And that came out in the work that we did with our communities. We also, though, had quite a high proportion of people who said, actually, I don't want to find myself in an emergency in the first place. So I'd really like you to help us and help me not have one in the first place. So they became our purposes that we then design all of our work around. The next key element in there are our measures. So what does good look like when we deliver it? And unfortunately, we have found in the past that the whole emphasis on evaluation happens at the end, rather than understanding what evaluation should look like right from the very beginning. And that's what our measures allow us to do. And then the method is, actually, how do we do it? So our group of internal consultants who then helped departments and helped the service transform itself understood those first 2 relationships. The third key relationship then is something called check, plan and do. And the check phase is really making sure that we have evidence and data. So we have facts, and that things aren't based on anecdotal evidence or on people's perceptions or views. That's really the check part. The planning part then very much looks at how we can ensure that whatever system or process is put in place is as simple as possible. Simple for the people who are going to use it. So it's crucial that they are involved in developing that system or their process. And then the final part is to actually do it and then see what happens. And of course, that's a cyclical approach. So we continually evaluate the work and the changes that we've undertaken. So as we moved into the start really of our transformation journey, 2 officers, one of those was myself, we were effectively given the reins of 1/3 of the organisation. And in that 1/3 of the organisation, we were tasked with experimenting on new ways of working. But it wasn't developed by myself and my colleague Wayne, it was developed by the staff who were working in there. But there were some really key principles that we adopted to ensure that we got 1,000 brains working towards the 2 purposes that I just previously outlined. The first and most important of these principles was that we used an inclusive staff approach. So the work that we've done around the cultural journey in terms of moving away from command and control, moving away from hierarchy, had really started this inclusive approach for our staff in the preemptive months before we started going down the route of the transformation journey itself. We then ensured that we understood our purposes. So when we were experimenting, if it wasn't contributing to the purpose, the question would be asked, why are we then doing it? We also need to understand our demand and the risk, and then design our service around those things. And demand and risk is a really interesting concept in the fire and rescue service, because some people are more at risk from fires than others. So how do we deal with the fact that some have greater risk in comparison to others, whilst also recognizing the fact that actually anybody could be involved in an emergency at any point in time? So quite a challenge, but what that has really helped us do is understand how we deliver our services both in the last few years and going forwards into the future. Clear measures which relate to our purpose. This has probably been one of the most challenging parts of our journey of change over the last 7 years, and it continues to be a challenge for us. But those measures have to relate to the purpose, and they have to ensure that they allow us to continue to deliver against that purpose. Crucially, we needed to understand what value work looked like, and what we would drive out would be work that had no value against our purposes. And then finally, as much as we could, we had to have clear evidence-driven decision-making. Now, sometimes we wanted more evidence than there actually was available. So there were occasions where we had to take really a leap of knowledge into what could have been an unknown area. So as part of the experimentation in the 1/3 of the organisation, we really wanted to understand some ground truth about the way that we were then delivering our services. So on a daily basis, as a fire and rescue service, we get 999 calls come into fire control, and fire control mobilise the appropriate resources to that incident. We wanted to firstly look at how efficient and effective those response arrangements were. So when a crew goes out to a fire call, we have a set number of people that we have riding a fire engine who then undertake a range of different tasks when they arrive at the scene of the incident. So that seemed like a really sensible place to start in terms of the personnel numbers that were responding. So of course, because the fire engine's gone out the door, the assumption would be that on every occasion, we'd always have the right number of people riding that fire engine. So when we looked at how we provided our whole time response arrangements, we found some quite stark information out by actually interrogating the evidence that was available. So we found that crewing appliances were 17% accurate. And what I mean by 17% accurate was that on 204 occasions across a 9-month period that we interrogated, we had more than 5 people riding a fire engine. And 5 people is the number that we ride on all of our frontline whole-time fire engines. We then had, across that same period, 242 where we had too few people. Now, that didn't mean that we didn't go out with 5. It meant that we had to have a detachment, so someone coming from somewhere else, or we had to pay for overtime for someone to ride the fire engine on that day. We actually only had 95 shifts that were correctly crewed with 5 people from that station or from that area. So the question that we then asked ourselves, as we somewhat were staggered by that figure, because of course the fire engines continue to go out, were at what cost for an 83% inefficient system? And when we looked at the actual cost associated with that, we were in the region of, for that 9-month period alone, £350,000 to operate what we deem to be an 83% inefficient system. But of course, that has knock-ons to other parts of the business. So if crewing was low, we would cancel training courses. So across that 9-month period, we only filled 56% of our training course places. So what was really important to us about the systems thinking approach was it encouraged us to look at the system as a whole rather than looking at it in a silo manner or isolated from different parts of the organisation. So that was just one piece of evidence that we found about our whole-time response arrangements. But of course, not only do we provide response arrangements, we also provide prevention activities, which are a crucial part of the work that we do. And we were delivering in the region of 30,000 home fire risk checks at the time. What we wanted to do was understand what that looked like from a systemic perspective. So looking at the period that you can see on the slide in front of you of September 10 to September 11, you can see that on the left-hand side of the screen, the time taken to input the data into the system really fluctuated tremendously and then started to level off. When we looked at 9 months worth of those HFRCs and we applied the thinking, system and performance relationship to it, we had thought that by asking in the region of 80 questions to a resident when we went out to their home, that not only would make them safer, but it would also be really useful information for us to have. So we created a system whereby crews, technicians, retained staff, prevention teams would go out and they'd use a paper-based form. We had no mobile working back in 2010, 2011. And they would fill in a paper-based form, which would then come back to their station or their department, be put in a tray for someone from the admin team to then input. When we really investigated what that meant in terms of the performance, it would mean that for one person alone inputting that 9 months worth of data, it would have taken them 2 years. And then we asked ourselves the question, so how really useful was that data? Actually, of the 80-some questions, we only ever used around about 10 information sets. So just by thinking something was the right thing to do, then by following it through, we were able to understand what the ground truth really looked like. So the question is, how did we then bake our bread in the service in terms of delivering what we've delivered since 2010, 2011? So I've already mentioned the cultural journey that we had started back in 2008. The next most important part was to help staff understand the gravity of the financial situation that we faced. And we recognised that the financial acumen across the whole organisation needed lifting. So every year since roughly 2011-2012, we have used something called the financial challenge to help all of our staff firstly understand where the budget comes from in the first place, because people were not really aware of that, how it got spent. Again, people very unaware that roughly 70 to 75% of our budget is spent on staff wages. And then looking at other areas where actually the spend of the organisation would have been on things like buying fire engines or new equipment. It's really important that staff understood that financial challenge. And we used something really simple, infographics, face-to-face briefings with managers and with teams and departments, because we really wanted staff to be involved from the outset. That staff involvement really began with this input around the financial challenge, but then bringing people together on a voluntary basis to a very large symposium which looked at staff ideas about how we could be more effective and more efficient. Of course, we then had working groups that looked at certain areas following on from that symposium, led by staff, not necessarily led by a senior officer, but driven by staff within the organisation. And of course, the experiment that we were able to run in the north of the county for 9 months allowed for a really great transfer of knowledge and understanding around the systems thinking methodology. A really important part for us is political engagement with our fire authority members, because they are the body that set the strategic direction for the organisation. They've been involved right from the very beginning, as you would expect. Representative body involvement's also been crucial. The fire service is a heavily unionised organisation, and so it's important that trade union bodies firstly are recognised within the organisation, but then secondly involved right from the very beginning, because we should be aiming for a win-win. That's a win for the residents and a win for all of our staff, which ultimately means a win for trade union members. But that means we have to compromise and we have to be pragmatic. We have to have highly productive working relationships. That doesn't mean it's easy. And when I meet with the trade unions on a monthly basis, we don't always agree. In fact, we rarely agree on a number of things. But the important bit is that we have a relationship and we have a conversation. Out of the 9-month piece of work, we realised that the way that the service had been set up was creating competition for resources. So we restructured the whole organisation from one which had been structured to be coterminous with our local councils, that's districts and boroughs, to one that was based a little bit more geographically across the service. And indeed, only in the last 6 months, we've re-looked and are re-experimenting with that service restructure. But what that allowed us to then do was to use the natural retirement profile to allow us to make a number of the savings in the very first years. We also carried out a strategic cover review, and this looked at the location of fire engines and special appliances. So these are appliances that are not at every single fire station, and we may only have 1, 2 or 3 around the county. And the strategic cover review determined that for some special vehicles, we actually could reduce them, and for others, we could remove them by providing better equipment on fire engines themselves. We've subsequently also run Community Safety Options 1 and 2, and they've run over the last 3 or 4 years, and that's included changes again to the whole time crewing structure to make it much more efficient than it has been previously, changes to the way that our staff operate whilst they're on fire stations, and again some further changes to the vehicles that are provided. Really importantly, over the last couple of years, we've also restructured the strategic team. It's really important as a strategic leader to be leading from the top, and we are all involved in the change process, so we are all directly affected by us. We've also undertaken a rota restructure for something called our Becci duty system, and these are officers who are on call for 24 hours a day, who will respond from their home address. Again, based on demand and risk, that allowed us to streamline that approach far more appropriately. I've mentioned whole-time crewing quite a lot already. We've also undertaken a number of departmental reviews, and we are now actually just restarting that process again, having just finished off Community Safety Options number 2, which was very much looking at the emergency response side of things. We've recently renegotiated a new retained duty system payment scheme, which is outside of the nationally agreed terms and conditions. And we've done that in order to make it more fair, but also to try and make it more attractive for people who will want to join the retained scheme. A number of years ago, we introduced something called intelligent-led mobilising. This is where our control room staff do not just rely on a computer telling them how many resources to send to a specific type of incident. They gather information from a caller. They use the information that they get to make a robust decision about it might need less fire engines than the computer is saying, or it might need more. And most recently, through our shared fire control with West Midlands, we've launched something called 999i, which allows fire control during a 999 call to take over the video function and the camera function on someone's mobile phone, so they can actually see the incident live, again enhancing the intelligence that allows them to make decisions. We use intelligent-led prevention targeting, so this is about understanding who is most at risk across our county, and we risk stratify the whole of the county and then target specific groups for what are called our safe and well visits. These are visits into people's homes that address not only fire-related issues, but other community safety matters that they might be experiencing. We've gone down the route of shared services. We have, as I mentioned, a joint fire control with the West Midlands. We have a joint emergency transport services with Staffordshire Police. That deals with both police and fire service vehicles. We have a joint stores and logistics, again with our police colleagues. We have a joint occupational health department, again with our police colleagues. And we also then use a number of other partners to provide things like payroll, pensions and finance systems, because it's much more efficient to do it together than it is for us to do it on our own. We introduced mobile working as part of our programme around about 2012, but importantly, the apps and the systems were developed by the staff who use them. We have developed them with a community interest company from a university. So we have very similar outlooks in terms of community benefit, as they have a CIC, which is about student benefit. So the important part is that the staff who are going to be using the mobile working applications actually have helped design, test and develop those applications themselves. Every year we run something called Dragon's Den, and this is where our budget holders present to a group of our directors about 6 months into the financial year where they're at in terms of their budget and what their predicted spend looks like, and therefore what they expect in terms of an underspend at the end of the financial year. This has also helped enormously in terms of managers understanding the financial responsibility that they have across the organisation. And then finally, we moved to a 3-tier of measures approach about 2 years ago. So we have strategic measures. These are things like the number of incidents that we've attended, the number of safe and well visits that we've conducted. We have geographic measures, and this is our risk stratification across the county. This is how we use data to identify those that are most at risk. So, for example, over the last 10 years, the 4 common factors in anyone who has lost their life in a house fire here in Staffordshire is smoking, alcohol, mobility, and being over the age of 65. they are prevalent time and time again. So we use that information at a geographical level to help us target. And then the final tier of measures is individual. And this is very much about engaging with those people who've received our services and finding out what we could have done better. Could we have done something differently to help you get back to normality? Could we have delivered our safe and well visit in a way that would have helped you understand it more than maybe you did? So that move to a 3 tiers is really important for us. The question is, so what? So the first graph you can see there just shows you the reduction in incidents over the last 8 years. And you can see that from 2009, 2010, we were at around about 13,000 incidents a year. Last year, we were at 8,300. So through our targeted prevention work and work with schools, with businesses, etc., we've been able to drop the number of calls by around about a third. And in terms of deaths and injuries in accidental dwelling fires, so these are people getting hurt or dying in a house fire, you can see there that we've roughly halved that amount over the same period. We had plateaued, and part of the reason why we plateaued was because of the behaviour that had been created through something as simple as a RAG report or a target. Once it was green, people didn't need to focus in on anything else, and it was creating the wrong sort of behaviour. So in 2011, 2012, we removed targets and empowered and trusted people to do the right thing. In terms of the financial outcomes, since 2010, 2011, you can see there that we've made savings of £8.2 million. We've also financed our capital expenditure programme for the last 8 years through internal cash, and we have reduced our debt, so that's our borrowing for loans that we had previously, by about £5 million. And that's great, very hard numbers there. And what was really important to us was to understand, what does it mean to staff? So over the last couple of years, we've undertaken 2 independent research projects carried out by a local university to really look at how our industrial relations is operating across the service. And this isn't just about working with trade unions, this is about the whole piece across working with staff and helping staff to be included in the programme of change. And you can see there's a quote there lifted from the research that Dr. Mather did on our behalf. I thought you might help to share a few lessons learnt with you. The first one is really around how the methodology has helped us to continue and provide a consistent approach to the way that we deliver change across the organisation. So we don't salami slice, we don't cancel discretionary spend. We encourage people to really understand what's going on, understand the system that they're operating in, and then understand how to change it. I've mentioned a lot already about how staff have been involved continually throughout the process. But before they can be involved, they really need to understand the challenge. Once they understand the challenge, then they can decide if they wish to contribute or not. Importantly, we recognise that we were not focusing on an outside-in purpose, it was the other way around. But by understanding it as an outside-in, we're able to ensure that any work we undertake is directed at those 2 purposes. And by using a system that helps people work together towards a common purpose, it's much more effective than the system we had previously, whereby people were competing for resources. The evidence that I shared with you around the way in which our fire engines were crewed and the way that our home fire risk check administration was conducted was hard evidence. And hard evidence is absolutely crucial in terms of understanding what's going on in your organisation. You can't just use anecdotal evidence to make these really important decisions on. We did remove targets and RAG reporting because we felt it created poor behaviour. People were only focused on a box becoming green rather than carrying on doing the right thing at the right time. Important for us was to understand what was going on in the system first and then experiment with it. we naively, and I was part of the transformation team at the time, we naively thought we understood what was going on in our organisation. We did not recognise the complexities and the interdependencies between departments, teams, stations and watches. So by understanding it, we were able to at least recognise that if you make a change over here, then that ripple effect will mean A, B and C over there. So it was really important that we understood our system. Equally as important is to only collect data if it helps you achieve your purpose. Now, of course, like any local authority, we are challenged by the fact that staff want to collect data. We are challenged by the fact we're required to send to government certain items of information, but we try to only collect data that helps us achieve our purpose. And finally, understanding that measurement is one of the most challenging things that we have done over the last 7 years. Truly understanding how to measure things has been a real challenge for us. So a bit of a brief pit-stop tour of what we've done over the last few years as a service. I'm happy to take questions.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much, Becky, for a great case study. So the first one is from Rebecca. What type of community engagement activities were conducted to ascertain the service's purpose, and how could these have been improved? What type of community engagement activities did you undertake? So
there were a number of different things that we did. We are required to engage with communities to develop something called our integrated risk management plan, which is basically our business plan for a number of years. So we had an opportunity through face-to-face briefings, surveys, focus groups that actually were already readily available to us. So we went out and spoke to people. You can always do more. You can always try and get to access more people within your community. And reflecting on it, I think one of the things that we could have done was use the captive audience that we have in terms of our home fire risk checks. We probably didn't at that time use those natural occurring opportunities as much as we could have done. So whilst we did engage with a number of our community members, we could have definitely done more.
Okay, that's great, thank you. The second question from Rob. Did you bring the system thinking performance model with you when you came into your post, or was it already there? And did you use outside resources to help you with it?
That's a great question, thanks Rob. So we used an organisation called Vanguard to come in and help the service. The focus was around them helping us to create our own internal pool of consultants, so that we owned the change as an organisation, because we felt that was very important in terms of sustainability beyond the point at which Vanguard went away from the organisation. So over the last 7 years, we've continued to use the same methodology and developed people in-house. And actually only just in the last sort of 6 weeks or so, we have brought our colleague from Vanguard back in just to do a little bit more training with some newer members of our transformation support team. So it wasn't anything I was aware of previously, other than knowing where it had come from in terms of Toyota and lean systems, that sort of thing. But it was very different because this was very much focused around public service delivery.
The next question from Kim. How did you track the Staffordshire perceptions throughout the change?
So one of the things that we were really keen not to do was to create a really bureaucratic and cumbersome system for managing all of our change. So we tried to keep it as really simple as possible. During the 9 months when Wayne and I were experimenting with a third of the organisation, we had an oversight board who we would report to on a monthly basis. And we generated a number of checkpoint and highlight reports, is probably the easiest way to describe it, although they wouldn't be in the same format that many people would be accustomed to. At the end of that 9 months, we then presented to the organisation our findings and our recommendations for the first tranche of changes that would help the service deliver against the first £4 million worth of savings. What's really important for me, though, is at that time and continuing today, we do not say to the team, you need to go and find £4 million worth of savings. What we say is it needs to be effective and efficient. In terms of the ongoing change, it is measured through a dashboard within each of the different directorates that we've got. So they look at those measures and determine whether that activity, if it's a new activity, for example, has made a difference. So if I take our risk stratification work, for example, we now target what we call gold, silver and bronze households, and these are the people who are more at risk. So quite rightly, within our set of strategic measures, we now look at how many fires in those properties we are going to. So we can correlate those that have had a safe and well visit against the number that who are then possibly experiencing a fire or hopefully not. So we try to link it all the way through from the very start of developing a change so that it enhances an impact on our strategic measures.
There's another question from Kim. What was the biggest challenge you faced as a leader throughout the transformation?
Fantastic question, Kim. Really interesting. Biggest challenge. I'd actually written it down on my notes to say, and I didn't say it. So thanks very much for giving me the opportunity to. I think the biggest challenge is the seductive nature of the old world. It might not be perfect, but it's the world that we're comfortable with. So we certainly found trying to introduce new ways of working to people who had done things the same for years and years, the challenge around people thinking that that meant that they hadn't been doing very well for all those years was a really interesting one for us. And that, I think, does continue to be a challenge for us today. We like the way that we do things in organisations, so to try and challenge those perceptions and that way of thinking, for some can be really difficult, but what we have to continue to do is continue to challenge that thinking all the time.
Another good question here from C. How big were the HR and union issues and how did you overcome them?
So obviously, in terms of the HR issues, you know, they were very much linked directly into our responsibilities under employment law. So things like redeployment opportunities, we haven't had to make any compulsory redundancies. We have used voluntary redundancy. We do have an enhanced package. That in itself creates issues because only one part of our organisation can access that package because of the nationally agreed terms and conditions for firefighting staff. So our professional services staff, if they wished to, and their department through the review was identifying that there were roles that were no longer required, if there weren't redeployment opportunities that they wanted to take, they could take a voluntary redundancy enhanced package. Our grey book staff can't, so our firefighting staff can't. That has caused a couple of issues, and it's not just here in Staffordshire, that's across the country. In terms of the union issues, because we work very hard at our working relationships, and we talk about the problems that we have right from the very beginning, we have been able to work very productively with our trade unions. That doesn't mean that we haven't had failure to agree notices from them, but it does mean that we're able to work through those problems rather than end up at somewhere like the technical advisory panel down in London or any form of mediation. We have been down that road and it was quite painful for the organisation. It was probably around about 2008-ish that happened. And both the rep body representatives at the time and the senior managers at the time on the way back up from that meeting said, we're never going to do that again. We have to have these difficult conversations. We have to be open and honest with each other about the things that are going to present us both with challenges. So they could have been really significant. And I think something else to just add, in the midst of all of that, nationally, there was a fire and rescue service strike. And that was about the nationally agreed terms and conditions in relation to pensions. So at the same time we've been transforming locally, we've managed that whole process along with a national industrial action, but managed to still deliver the outcomes that I showed you before on the slides.
The next one from Rebecca. Has there ever been a conflict between staff wanting to participate in the involvement mechanism of the change and undertaking their duties?
Conflict is probably too big a word. There's undoubtedly, for staff who get involved, it's created more demands on their time, but they've recognised when they've come into it. So when staff have been involved in working groups, they've had like a finite period of time that they've been running for, so it hasn't been an ongoing thing. Importantly, within all of our management board structures, we have open chairs and we have trade unions sitting around the table as part of that decision-making process. So when we run a new project under our service delivery, we will go out for volunteers to be involved in that. And those people recognise that it will place an extra burden on them, but they recognise that before they volunteer for it. So I wouldn't use the word conflict, but it's definitely increased demand for those people who have participated.
The next question from Philip: what did you do specifically instead of RAG reporting?
So Philip, we use statistical process control, which I'm sure people are aware of, but very briefly, it allows us to look at our performance over a rolling 3-year period, understand what stability in the system looks like, and then interrogate where we have either peaks or troughs. And the peaks or troughs can be both good and bad. So an example for you, last year we experienced a large number of prison fires. Previously, what we would have done is just, we'd have had a knee-jerk reaction. But because we were able to recognise that it was almost a one-off, we were able to work with Crown Premises around them putting in place certain measures that would result in a reduction in the number of fires that we were going to in the prisons. So we use that approach through all of our measures, so statistical process control.
There's probably 3 or 4 questions around this similar sort of theme on what type of resistance and challenges did you experience within the organisation and how did you manage those?
So for a number of people, the resistance was around the fact I've always done it like this and it's always been okay, so why would I change it? So for people who were involved, especially in the 9-month work, and then for line managers across the service, we gave them the opportunity to experience the systems thinking approach for themselves, gave them development opportunities, and then they went back into their own areas, looked at very small bite-sized pieces of their responsibility and transformed it themselves, then came back in and reported into the organisation what they'd done differently and how it had made a difference. So people need to have light bulb moments. That was definitely something that we learned during, and we continue to learn. Until you sort of see it and feel it for yourself, it's really difficult to recognise it off a piece of paper. So it was about creating those opportunities for people. In the very early days around the prevention work, a number of operational staff very much felt that wasn't their role. Their role was to rescue people and put fires out. But actually, over the last 7 years, through helping people understand that they're still saving lives when they go out and do a safe and well visit, what we are now seeing is a different story out on our fire stations. So when staff go out and they deliver a safe and well, if they never go back to that property again, they'll never know what difference that they've made, especially if they've referred a resident on for extra support from someone maybe like Age UK or the local council. So we now follow up all of those to get feedback from our partners about the difference that staff have made, and then we feed that back in to those staff and to the whole organisation. So storytelling has been really important in terms of people understanding the narrative behind the numbers.
That's great, thank you very much, Becky. There's a few unanswered questions, but we will answer those and post them as part of the conclusion of the webinar. I've just got a couple of closing slides now on the SIG. So just wanted to mention our first guide that the SIG has produced, Introduction to Managing Change. This covers what is change management, the relationship between P3 and managing change, overview of approaches to managing change, and we've documented about 23 different approaches to change, key factors in successful change, change success measurement, and then considerations for choosing an approach to managing change. And this is available using that link. You can purchase it from the APM or download it. Just what resources. So we've got a microsite on the APM website for the Enabling Change SIG. We've just sent out our most recent newsletter, and our main conference is on the 22nd of March in London, and it's around inspiring change in complex and uncertain times. We've now got a really good lineup of speakers, and the conference is being opened by John Glynn, who is the APM chair. So details have been sent out, and details are on our website. Just talked about the Managing Change Guide, and you can contact the SIG using that email address, get involved, ask any questions, and we'll reply. So I'd just like to say thank you so much to Becci for giving us a really great case study that sort of fits within our public services change practitioner group area. And thank you everyone for taking the time out to attend this webinar this lunchtime. Thank you very much.